Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Atrium. So thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the legal and digital people, and pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So Juno James have been a photographer for a very long time, and in fact, she's one of the early ones that started, basically doing historical photography documentation of the indigenous community. And more recently, she had a book published, and it's been a long time coming. She spent so much time working on it, and she had a lot of people contributing to that book. We got a book launch today as well, but the book is called Until Justice Comes. So it's a very interesting book with lots of very good photographs in it. And today's panel discussion, we have both Tsoutas and also Catherine Lorenzo. So Nick, we all know Nick very well. He's been a curator and sort of basically supporter and patron of the arts for a very long time. Catherine is basically a historian who's very familiar with an academic and also very familiar with the First Nation history and culture. So that would be a perfect discussion about Juno's journey, how she got to do all those photos, and also the history of her basically association with the First Nation people. So I'd like you all to welcome Juno James, Nick Tsoutas, and Catherine Lorenzo.
Okay. Now, we're going to have we'll try to keep it as informal as possible, but also keep within the format. I'll do a brief introduction. I'll introduce the speakers, and they can actually have a few minutes to say a few words, and then we'll do a Q&A and question and discussion, but more like a discussion, and sort of like try to be as generous as possible. I think you promoted it as a book launch, but I'm just sort of worried that after 15 book launches, when do you stop having a book launch?
Just called it a conversation.
Yeah, okay.
So welcome to the conversation as opposed to a book launch. But now the hard sell is that the books are available for purchase, so we can double as a book launch, and Juno will generously sign the book to people who are interested. So today we're here to talk about Juno James' extraordinary publication, Until Justice Comes, 50 Years of the Movement of Indigenous Rights, a collection of Juno's photographs and critical essays about her photography, her art and life commitment to justice for Indigenous people in Australia. Something the title itself, along with the disappointment of the referendum outcome, suggests that we are still waiting. And this is, sort of like for me and Juno, and I know most people, this is a really tragic state of Australian affairs, political life, where we still can't get the issue of Indigenous rights, Indigenous justice, Indigenous equality right. And for me, so I think, how much longer do we have to wait, to recognise and respect people, the First Nations people of this country, and so we're still waiting. It's a book that celebrates survival, despite the politics and culture of oppression that exists. It's about history, social, cultural, and political histories, both as a record and in the making. It's about both as a record and in the making. It's about activism and the people who stood on the front line and demanded change and were prepared to put their lives on the line. It's about photography as well. The power of photography to acknowledge its capacities in relation to the social context of their times. It's about recognising and acknowledging heroes who displayed an awareness of the importance of their own actions, and the need for change. It's about respect. It's about acknowledging people and respecting people as human beings for who they are and for their rightful ownership of this land. It's about respect. And the desire for justice, not just for First Nations people of this country, but for the land itself. And as you weave your way through the photographs, you become very conscious of the fact that Juno is constantly photographing this land in relation to the people themselves as well. Juno weaves another history, a history of Indigenous people that has been either forgotten or excluded, and more say that better than James Baldwin, and I quote from the book itself, history does not just refer to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. History is present in all we do, and since it is history frames our reference, our identities and our aspirations. And when you look at those photographs of all the players involved in all the activists and that were involved in these debates and fought very hard, you become very much aware that James Baldwin's voice echoes, and I know that he's been a great influence for Juno's work. And I think of this as I view her photographs in relation to what and how she captures and defines Indigenous history and the demands for change. And I'll paraphrase a quote from John Mundine, for to forget is to offend, and we need to learn to remember together. And I think this is actually a really important statement in the book, that what Juno has done is created a context for us to all remember together, and how to remember together, and to understand that the memory of oppression needs justice, and the memory of injustice needs to be redressed. James's photography honours that remembering, showing a culture that is strong, defiant and resilient. And she does so by capturing moments of empowerment and a truth reflected in every image that reflects a raw emotion, a courage, and depicts people in their everyday context, or in the activism or pursuit for justice, in politics, art, culture, theatre and dance. She does so with love and the beauty in their survival. And as David Malouf suggests, in a country that is so poor at keeping in touch with its own social history, Juno is a national treasure, for she brings her close connection to Indigenous life and consciousness and the keen eye of a master photographer to 5 decades of Indigenous activity in politics, in the arts and in the intimacies of daily being. From the very early days of political mobilisation to stolen generations to the Uluru Statement, these last 50 years have been a rich history to tap into that deserves to be remembered, and she does that with extraordinary deftness. She was there for most of the key historical events. She was there within, immersing herself and taking those photographs that honour and confer the importance of all those who contributed to the demand for justice. I think it's a really important and timely book, and you know, given the fact that Australia voted against the referendum, I think it speaks volumes about what we're dealing with, but it also speaks volumes about the courage to actually not only live the life as a photographer and do the work that she has done within the Indigenous community, but to publish a book that will become a landmark of realising the importance and significance of those histories. So that's my little brief introduction, and I think we should, Maloof is right, we should treasure people, we should honour people, because art on its own is really difficult in this country. All artists here understand that, it's not an easy job. We live in a culture that actively resists that cultural significance that artists provide for this community. And so it really is an important publication, and it not only recognises the extraordinary contribution that Juno has made, but it sort of contextualises with a lot of writings, and really important writings, and important because Catherine, right, is one of the writers, as I am, and how are you? And that's so. Let's start. I'm going to start by introducing Catherine first. And Catherine is a historian, and she's
art historian. I'm an art historian.
Art historian, yes. As an art historian and an adjunct professor at Monash University, her research on Australian photography, art and architecture examines cross-cultural and disciplinary and transnational threads. She has published extensively and served as an editorial advisor on national and international journals, including the History of Photography and the Journal of Art Historiography, and has co-authored Australian art exhibitions Opening Our Eyes into 2018. Her current project that she's working on with John Mundine, the Bundjalung curator and writer, examines selected exhibitions of Australian art in Europe since 1937, all of which makes her an ideal person to discuss Juno's work and here today. So please welcome Catherine de Lorenzo.
Well, hello everybody. I have a few reflections. I might just begin by quickly going back to the moment when I first met Juno. Maybe that kind of context might be useful. I wasn't going to, but I think it might be. So it was in 1987. It was leading up to an exhibition at the SH Urban Gallery for the highly contentious year of 1988. And the exhibition was called A Changing Relationship, and it was looking at Indigenous and non-Indigenous art. At that point in time, I was teaching out at New South Wales Uni in architecture, as it happens. Don't ask me why, but I was. And I was also doing a PhD on photographic images of Aboriginal people. And and I was looking, no one had really done that. So therefore, nowadays you'd never do it, but I took on the job of trying to look at the history of representation. So in the 19th century, there was all that horrible, typology stuff that was going on into the 20th century. By the middle war years, between the wars, there was the upsurge of art of journals like Walkabout and the National Geographic kind of thing, like human interest in different peoples around the world, but it was still, it wasn't like measuring skulls and all that sort of thing, but it was still a version of primitivism. But in the 70s and 80s, everything changed. And in the 70s and 80s in Sydney was the best place to be in Australia. We had, in the 70s, it's really important to say, we had the Whitlam government with support for the arts. We had so many Indigenous-run organisations in the arts and medicine and law and everything. And we had lots of galleries where there were exhibitions of Indigenous art and co-curated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And that was happening in the 70s, it was happening in the 80s. And it was vibrant. And because so much of the work being done, and this is in art galleries, was from Southeast Australia, and it was recognising what was going on. It changed perceptions of Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal art, so it wasn't just bark paintings. And photography came into the mix. So I wanted to find out about Juno's work for this exhibition, but also, as it happened, from a PhD. And there were other photographers too who were working with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities to try and teach the rest of us about one thing and another. And it was a very exciting and really important time in our culture. We need it again now. We need a visionary government, and we need, the struggle continues, but there were massive changes happening. So, so that's how I first met Juno in relation to the exhibition that I was working on with Dinah Dyser. Anyway, what I wanted to say about this project, I just want to focus for a moment on the book itself. So Juno's work has been published in so many different areas, in newspapers, in Aboriginal newspapers and things, in journals, some of them with small niche readerships, others with massive readerships, and so on. She's had, as I think probably all of you know, key exhibitions with publications in them. And obviously I've seen many of those exhibitions over the years. But of course the catalogues remain treasured things on shelves, but the exhibitions come and go. What this book does is to capture all of that, this long trajectory, and the value of a book on all of this is something that really hits home looking at it now, because we can hold it in our hands and open it up and flick through it and go back. I think I saw that person on an earlier page, and so you see the people that keep coming up and up, and you kind of personalise it in a slightly different way because it's in a book. And it's just, and it's mapping all this energy and resilience and kindness over, from everybody's part, over such a long period. And I think that, and you can kind of dwell on it in a different kind of way when you've got it like that. It also, though, for those who are ignorant about what has happened in Australia, the gains, the losses, as Nick has said, and that we all presumably understand, but the gains that have been made, to understand those gains, something about those gains, and the energy, and the bravery, and the pluck, you know, to go and do it, is captured in this volume. It's there, and I think that's terrific. And for people like myself, like I am more and more, I've become engrossed in archives. To have the archive in a book, it's not the whole archive, of course, but to have that archive, to have so much stuff, to be able to have it on hand is just fabulous for new research to be done and can generate new insights, new understandings. So I think that's one of the things that has come across to me from the book. That there are lots of different viewpoints. I've got a little essay in it too for what it's worth, but it's really about this. It's really about the images, and a number of the chapters in it are images. They're visual essays. The essays are all the way through. The images are all the way through, but the images just speak so much on their own, and I think the other thing, it just shows the strength of the images individually, but collectively. I mean, that's a strong thing. And the obvious thing is that Juno was there doing it all, just never stopping, and getting and just refining everything about it, not just the photography. The photography is important. It's the connection between all of what was going on and us, but it's refining that, but it's also informing, and I think those things are just, they really, they're the qualities that really announce themselves, I think, with the book. I think it's a great contribution to future developments and insights. Well done, Juno. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, to everyone here, I don't think Juno needs an introduction, but I feel we should, because
No, you don't.
yes,
We should.
We need to acknowledge that.
We should.
Right. It's only going to be a short one, Juno. What you're saying there, Catherine, the fact that it's there in, from a research point of view, the fact that so much is there in one volume that accounts for multiple key moments of history, but also sort of like when some of the photographs, like the one on the cover, for example, which I think is an extraordinary photo because it's, sort of looking out to the distance, and it's photographed from behind, and it sort of captures something about desire, sort of desire, when is it going to become such a beautiful image, that one.
And listening. Listening
Yeah.
to the water and the land.
Yeah. Well, for the people that don't know, Juno, she was born in Hungary and arrived here as a child in '49. She's a photographer and writer. She also had theatre training at NIDA, for the people that don't know, wanting to be an avant-garde theatre director, which I think she kind of lived a life in that sort of like avant-garde she has had a lifetime's commitment to the movement for Indigenous rights in Australia. For 50 years she has exhibited her photographic narratives widely in Australia, UK, Europe, the USA, and has been awarded prestigious fellowships for her photographic archive. Juno's photographs and texts have been published, as Catherine mentioned, across a range of different media that includes things like the now defunct Meanjin, Eat, the Monthly, the National Indigenous Times, and many more, including, and she's also been involved, including Rachel Perkins, the First Australians, We Wait No More, Under Another Sky, Proof, Portraits of the Movement, Sacred Ground, Evidence, and 40 years of evidence, 40 years of dance activism, The Quiet Activist, are all projects that she's been involved with. Native Title Business, Unfinished Business, the Ampera Artist for Land Rights, and you could tell by the titles of these exhibitions that she's been involved with. They're all sort of like politically motivated, activist oriented, you know, speaking sort of like with courage on subjects that haven't been opened up properly. Her contribution to Australian art culture are just too expensive to list them all here today, but safe to say she has exhibited nationally, internationally, and her work has been collected by all major institutions in Australia and abroad, a testament to a lifelong commitment to land rights and justice for Aboriginal people in Australia. And it is no accident that this grand opus is entitled Until Justice Comes, 50 Years of Movement for Indigenous Rights. Juno James.
My memory just was going back to when I was at school. So I was born in Hungary, came here in '49, and I found over time, even when I was a child, that being an outsider, never knowing what it would be to be born here, and having a critical intelligence, which is what I have, made me examine this country. And what I found was people who didn't know each other. An indigenous population had been here for 65,000 years, and a mixed European and mainly Anglo-Saxon population who actually didn't know each other. And this enraged me so much. And even at school, I remember I was at a girls' boarding school, and they told these stupid stories, you know, fairy stories of Australian history. So, you know, the three white boys walked over the Blue Mountains, and this was such a big deal, you had to talk about it for a week. So my hand went up and said, what else happened here? And nobody could answer me. And, you know, I thought about my own history, like between the time I was born, Hungary was occupied by the Germans. By the time we left, it was occupied by the Russians. And I could not get this ridiculous stories that we were being told at school had any reality at all. So there was a burning kind of curiosity and rage that grew up in me. And as John Mundine points out in one of the excellent 17 brilliant essays in that book, he says that, and I've had it said to me before, that restlessness and that curiosity and that displacement that was part of my being kind of connected with Aboriginal people who were displaced in their own country. And I recognised that in them. And I also recognised that they were invisible. They were invisible. Most Australians knew nothing about them. This was before the 70s even, I was aware of this. And so, you know, photography, you know, I'd been through theatre and filmmaking and publishing, but when I realised, as a researcher on a film about the stories of Uluru, I went there from the Yellow House, and while having read Strelo, Stana, Mumford, all the major anthropologists of the time, and I was reading this, and there was something speaking to me and saying, you have to find the people who own these stories. You can't make this film without finding them. So I said to everybody, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go up to Alice Springs and find these elders. Now, in the 1970s, to find anybody was no easy thing. And it was a kind of absolutely outlandish proposal, according to most people at the time. But it just, and I have this Geiger counter that an Aboriginal elder said to me, you've been with us for a long time, maybe other lifetimes, you've been with us a long time. But I had this guide encounter that said to me, I have to find those people. And I went up to Central Australia and I hitchhiked out to this Ebenezer Downs, and I just sat down underneath the tree to take in the country, because I'm always forming relationships with the country, and just watching the light and trying to think, how am I going to explain what I'm doing to this mob that's sitting with a camp up there underneath the trees. And no more had the light begin to fade, and the kids got up, they came down, they got my bundles of food and my swag, and I was sitting beside Mary, who was the elder woman there, and she said, we know you arrived in Alice Springs three days ago. We know who you're looking for. He'll be here by and by. And he was here by and by. And we ended up in another camp that was outside Alice Springs, a fringe camp at school. That's the hardest conditions anybody could live under. You were an hour from water, you were hassled by the police all the time. And eventually, it took me a few days, then I said to him, why are we here? Why do you choose to be here? Not in Armata, not in Papunya, not in any of the communities. And he said, because we got nothing. We're not allowed to speak our language. We're not allowed to practice our culture better here. So he was maintaining an outlaw camp, if you like, and people were coming and going all the time because they were planning illegal ceremonies. But that thing of not being able to speak the culture and not being able to speak the language visually spoke to me. That was my experience too. And so, it galvanized me into looking in another way. And from that time on, it just changed my whole mindset, my whole being, and my whole sense of purpose about being in this country. And I was thinking, we were making a film, and I thought, well, how many people are going to see this film in an art house movie? And we've got this really desperate situation here. And it just grabbed hold of me in a way that's never let go of me all this time. And then I started to see in terms of still images, and I thought, yes, still images, they're personal. It's between you and an image when you look at it. You can use them in a number of different settings. They can be in newspapers, they can be in journals, they can be on a wall, they can be in galleries, they can be in museums. There's all these different multiple usages. And there's one other factor here that links into something that Nick said, that my parents were extraordinary open-minded people. And my mother brought back from the Museum of Modern Art in '64 a book called Nothing Personal by James Baldwin and Richard Avedon, who were two pals who went to high school together in the Bronx. And what this book is, which is a masterpiece of the book, which has just been reissued by Tashkent, is an analysis of American society through portraiture. It goes through the daughters of the American Revolution, the politicians, the poets, the Allen Ginsberg, the Nazi Party, the guys in the factory, the musicians, Fabian, everybody, and the civil rights movement at the heart of it, and the analogy of America as a madhouse. So this was an analysis of American society that I kept on examining for years and years and years, because it showed me what photography could do. And it showed me that it had to be with a purpose, and it had to have a really rigorous intellectual scaffolding behind it. And my great good fortune was that Aboriginal people that I met recognised something in me, and they invited me. How did I turn up everywhere? I was invited up and down the country. This is a very much an insider's point of view, and it's informed always, everywhere where I went, what's happening here, what's the political background, what are we trying to achieve, what are you trying to achieve, what's the next move coming down the pike. that's the way I worked. Wherever I went, whether it was a small community or an organisation in Redfern, my questions were the same, and people picked me up and taught me stuff. And when when there were different points of view being put, and it could be quite confusing, I would go to various people and argue it out with them, and they would say, well, look, this is what this one thinks and that one thinks, and you have to make a decision which way you're going to go with this. So, I've really had this extraordinary insider experience where I have deep relationships, and what I hope you can see in those photographs, you can see those relationships. These is not by a photographer who turned up yesterday or last week or even last year. These are out of deep engagements, out of friendships, and I so respected and admired, people like Mum Cheryl, who were my mentors, who instilled in me this confidence that they had, that justice was achievable. That no matter how hard it looked now, before they had anything, but above all, there was this faith and belief, and even despite the hurt and the pain, a searching for the goodness in the Australian people, and a desire to come together and heal the nation, which is what I think we're all a part of. So I don't think of this as just a contemporary Aboriginal history of the last 50 years, although it is that, but it's also Australian history. We've all lived through these things. And that's what I'm hoping that the book will say. And with the 17 magnificent essays that are in there by many people who have worked with Aboriginal people, who have particular points of view, who have a particular interest in or a particular expertise in knowing one community or another, or one situation or another. So it's hopefully like a sort of kaleidoscope of views, not one view. I didn't ever want it to be just as this is one person's view. This is a view of a whole lot of people that can give you an insight into this complexity and this richness. I've always had a saying in my mind since I was a kid, and it goes to the fact that diversity is the real wealth of humanity. And in colonial societies, there's such a fear of difference. Well, this one's different this way, that way, that way. What is that about? What is that fear? It's like, racism. It's like a disease of the mind, where people haven't thought through these things properly. That's what I feel. And that's what I hope the book is an answer to, and a way in to say that, we need to know this history. We need to own this history. We need to not only acknowledge it and to respect the people who created it, but to claim it as our own. It's not out there. It doesn't belong to somebody else. It belongs to all of us. So that's what I'm trying to achieve with this book.
Thank you, Juno. I'll start the conversation with a couple of questions, and please feel free to intercede, or if you have a point that you want to sort of engage with, or ask a question that's not being addressed, please feel free to do so at any time. But to kick things off, when I first read your essay, Sustained Advocacy, Catherine, in your opening paragraph, you nailed something that I think is really important in looking at the photographs in this publication, because you and I'll paraphrase you said something a bit earlier, and Juno echoed it. It's about looking deeply, and throughout teaching curating, lecture one was always, if you're going to make a curator show, you have to understand how to look deeply at the art that you're going to be working with, and in that looking deeply, you sort of state that Juno's photographs acknowledge that awareness of photography's capacities to be more than functioning as records of particular people and specific events. For you state that her photography informs collective memory and reminds us of work that needs to be done. When the images are brought together, we sense a commitment and relationships that supersede the moment captured in a single photograph. That idea that the photograph supersedes its own subject, I think, is really important in relation to looking at Juno's work, but it's an important statement about photography itself. Do you care to just elaborate on that a little bit?
Trying to get my head back into
well, it's
into
the idea
writing
that photography's capacities to exceed its own image.
Yes. Well, I mean, that can happen in lots of ways, because an image might become iconic or something like that. But you know, within photography, let me just give a little bit of a background here. Back at that period that I was talking about, in the 70s and 80s, photography in Sydney was really undergoing a lot of change. There was a big conference, the first, I think, conference on photography held in Sydney, run by a fellow in adult education at Sydney University, and that was in the late 70s, and out of that came a group that used to meet at Sydney University. And Max, I don't know if the name Max Kosnoff means anything to anyone these days, but he was a well-known art critic and a photography writer, and he turned up to one of these seminars and he wrote about it later and said, you know what, there were people from every discipline in the university at these seminars. They weren't just artists, they weren't just photographers, they were there too. But there were all these different ideas and people had a vested interest. And he had never seen that within photography, that photography could be an agent, could have agency within lots of different disciplines, if you're at a university, but in lots of different contexts. It can work in different ways. I think that remains true over time too, that what becomes important to go and capture a shot of Simon Chan right now in this room doesn't just remain that. It becomes, it works through different contexts. We see that image. When we see it in different kinds. We've mentioned different kinds of public, different kinds of exhibit, different sorts of on your screen in lots of different, and it takes on new meanings. And I think that that originating thing, that moment when somebody got up and gave their talk or participated in the march or sat there and looked and just watched the tide coming in, that always remains crucial, but they take on additional things. It's easy to see, to reduce photography to a capturing of reality or a capturing of something, a moment in time, and it does that. But golly, it does a lot more. And I think this book is a testimony to that as well.
Juno mentioned that the invisible things that were present, and it sort of struck me that what you were talking about was that capturing something more that exceeds the image itself, and not all photography does that.
That's right.
And but that capturing more that speaks, that renders the invisible visible, that renders the unspoken spoken, And when you look at these photographs in the book, and particularly when we're thinking about activism and the politics of activism, there's all that I was so taken by that statement of yours, because there is something more beyond the photograph, and in discussing Aboriginality, beyond ethnography, which generated so much.
No, but I mean, Nick, I think what it needs to go to, I mean, that's clearly the case, that there's many different kinds of photography and very many different layers and ways in which it functions. And what I find very frustrating is how rarely people who look and examine photography go to what the actual intention of the photographer is, what the actual perceptual grid that they're working from is. And because I am essentially a European and I keep going back to Europe, and I see the regard in which photography is held in the rest of the world, there's been an endless frustration here that, we're still talking about the kindergarten stuff. We're still in this bloody sandpit, And all over the world, you can see photography used in such powerful ways, whether it's, exploring the psychoanalysis of being, or feminism, or the relationship between people and the objects in their life, any kind of subjects you care to throw up at it. It's just a medium. It's just a tool. Like a pen is, you can do anything with it. And the scope that of its possibility needs to be expanded hugely, and every now and again we get glimpses of it. There are some wonderful photographers here. There's some wonderful women photographers here. But, photography, apart from in these kind of new manifestations, friends of mine like Anna Zahalka, or, there's so many wonderful women. Like I had took part in a show last year down at Map Gallery that was about feminism and activism, and it had Ponch Hawkes and Sue Ford and many of my friends from women photographer friends from that generation, going back to the 70s, when we were all meeting and nutting out what we're doing with photography, It's been very specific, and it's a rigorous intellectual exercise, and that is so rarely seen. Yeah.
Can I ask why you think that is? And it's probably a question for both of you. It's a question of both how we do academia and also how we do activism. Why is there such a big gulf between the sophistication in Europe that is a natural seems to be a natural understanding, even a tradition of embracing all of the complexities of attention?
There's a great history of photography there. You just have to go around and look at it, Jules.
But do we not? Why don't we have that?
Because
photography is new. It's
Catherine has been
mid-19th
on this. It's quite right. Catherine and I spent some time in the 80s and 90s trying to take on the major institutions. The photography collections in most institutions is absolutely impoverished. Activism is an area that they have been terrified of. They're frightened to be on the wrong side of an argument, or I don't know what they're fearing.
Isn't it? It's so conservative and narrow, and yet even in the controversial settlement of this country, the people who came here were actually angry about conservative institutions from where they'd been shifted from. There was an anger. There's a natural anger in Australia. Why do you think that hasn't translated even?
There's a lot of fear, I think. I've sensed that all the major institutions, and I've got bits of work in it, but only by, really by brave curators who have just stood by me and slipped it in. But I think you look at how little, apart from, here's an interesting thing, Aboriginal activism in the major museum, no problem, bring it on, let's have more. Let's have Aboriginal curators, let's have it in every medium going. Non-Aboriginal activism causes terror. They do not know how to see it, whereas in any major collection in France, in Germany, in England, in the United States, whether it's in the National Portrait Gallery or the National Gallery or the National Photography Gallery or wherever, activism in photography is really valued. Don McCulloch is a national hero in London now. In each generation there are activist photographers who've got a particular burning issue that they want to make seen in a way that's never been seen before, and that's valued by the culture. I think that there's a nervousness and a fear about dealing with reflections of reality with kind of activism behind it. That's the only reason I can come up with, that there is across the board, and that's why this little exhibition in Melbourne that was women activists, I forget what it was called, it was at Map Gallery, curated by the wonderful Kelly Galbarby. How does that mean? Yes. So, you know, that was quite new to have an exhibition like that. Not since, you know, like, interestingly, when the ACP was formed, Wes Stacey and Narelle Perot, two really good friends of mine, got together with Marcia Langton. And Marcia said there's never been any kind of view of the photographs that exists by which an Aboriginal writer can indicate what the history of this country is in general, sweeping, but incisive and precise kind of statements. And so 17 photographers were pulled together, and Wes came around to my archive, and we looked through everything, and we printed up a lot. I was the second strongest contributor to that book. So that was the first actual narrative by an Aboriginal writer indicating what the history could be, seen as through the photography of 17 different photographers. But that was an outlying project, even though it was terribly popular, and you can't find a copy of that book anywhere, not even on Amazon, you know. But how many exhibitions like that have there been? The one Catherine mentions that she and Diana Dysart did, which was called A Changing Relationship in the late 80s. And that was about, let's have a look at this. What is our relationship to each other? And it was a marvellous exhibition of the S.H. Irving that had work in every medium. Yep. You had a pile of bots in there.
We did too.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. So, you know, it was very broad, but it takes outlying curators who have the courage to say, let's look at these issues and let's bring in. And isn't it interesting to see that activism by Aboriginal people, fine, bring it on, celebrate it in every museum up and down in the country, but activism not by Aboriginal people, why is there no place for that? I think that's a really interesting question that we might
Can I
look at.
throw in a couple of points? They're a bit disjointed, but they kind of are triggered by your question. One is that in terms of women photographers, it's important to realise that the first exhibition that promoted women photographers in Australia was done by Jenny Boddington, who was the first curator in an art museum. It's down in Melbourne. And it was done while she was a curator of photography, but it was also done for an outside organisation. And they were the people that Juno has mentioned and others. They're all feminist, young, really young photographers. So that was 1975. What was I had a couple of quick points to make. Sorry, I've just had a brain fart and can't quite remember them. But I think in terms of why is it that, I know about activist photography. Now, at the ACP, which started up in '72, by 1976, there was an exhibition there that was an eye-opener to me, because I'd never seen an exhibition like it. It was by John Rhodes, and it looked at Aboriginal opposition to mining up in Eastern Island land, and it was called Just Another Sunrise. And I had, I mean, I'd done art history, but somehow I had never seen an exhibition that was itself an argument. I'd only up to that point seen exhibitions as pictures. And so this traced in black and white photos, there were Aboriginal people from the area. They could not walk across their land because of the gigantic conveyor belt that was there to go and extract whatever, aluminium or whatever it was, and send it off to the ports. And his way of representing those mining families that came, and that interruption, was to use colour in a very deliberate, critical way. So we saw these giant trolleys full of stuff, sugar and stuff, in fact, from the supermarkets, and their big blue swimming pool, and all this stuff that was like grotesque. And so that was bought. That whole exhibition, in its entirety, was bought by the National Gallery of Victoria. And the concluding comment is it has never been shown. Not since 1976. It has not been shown. That is appalling. That is something dreadful.
And Rhodesy actually used to come and visit me, and one of his themes was he would be in despair because he tried to offer the whole collection to the Art Gallery in New South Wales, and they refused it. So it was not just that it was avoided, it was resisted. And that's a story I've heard from very many fine photographers in absolute despair.
And right now, the Art Gallery of New South Wales...
There's no photography curator?
No, there's no photography curator, but it has had the best archivist in any art institution in the country. There's now, he had to retire, but there is a replacement who's extremely well-meaning and very good. But we have all seen the art museum has been decimated. They've lost jobs, and they now cannot take photography archives are unlike any other artist's archives, really, because there are so many works. And the other difficult one is like video art and things like that too, because how do you maintain an up-to-date digital record of something that was, something that was made in the 1980s or something, So these are ongoing, these are issues, and we understand that they're big issues, but it's just very frustrating for us all. I mean, certainly for the artists, but it's. I'm not saying that they don't take archives. They've tried their best and they have been fabulous, but now they've had their legs cut off, So it's really tricky, and how we get things. I have a sister who was involved in theatre, and they had lots and lots of digital records of their work. It was kind of movement-based theatre, and it's a headache for everybody because none of us have the equipment to go and play these things. Most of us don't, and to get the expertise to translate it into something that will constantly need updating, frustrating. So, I don't know. It just. But why is it that Australia doesn't value artists in the same way European and other countries do? It's a big question that we need to understand more about.
About 5 or 6 years ago, I saw a brilliant exhibition at the Art Gallery in New South Wales, It was all done by Aboriginal photographers.
Yes.
They were all in black and white.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it was called, but it was brilliant.
Only 5 or 6 years ago.
It might have been that one by Judy and Mia.
2019.
Yeah, that a big
Oh,
one
that
in
one. Oh,
Australia.
yes, 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 yes.
Australia, yes, that was a
It was
good
the first
attempt.
time I ever saw
Yes, that was a good
anything
attempt.
like that.
There was an earlier one, maybe about 20 years ago. But,
My memory is.
I think it's a really good question, that because I think underscoring there's a debate raging in Australia about identity politics, right? Particularly in the art world, and there's a great centre of art people, I just refer to them as that, who actually believe that identity politics or activism or social politics has no right in art. And I think that's intrinsically, whilst it's specific to photography in this context, I think there's a pervasive view that exists in Australia that art is outside of politics. It's outside of activism. And yeah, okay, well, the Aboriginals, like you're saying, you know, that's fine, we'll put them on. But when it comes to real art, it's not about that. And if you look at, say, a lot of the biennales which have been about globalisation, oppression, and so on, a lot of the criticism has been that they're overwhelmingly indoctrinated through that discourse, and it's not much about art. And so the question is, you know, what is an artist and what is art is a really important question, and I think it keeps coming up again and again. I personally think that everything we do as artists or curators is political, and nothing sits outside of politics, right? And so Juno's work is really indicative of that she's creating critical essays that engage our perception and understanding of what it means to be Australian in this country. You can't exclude that outside a discussion on Aboriginality or a representation of Aboriginality. But at the same time, this issue of purity just doesn't go away. It's raging at the moment because of the Khaled affair, right? That there's again and again, I'm a constant viewer of new media, so I'm looking at that very closely, a critique of identity politics, that saying that it shouldn't be in contemporary art. Contemporary art is about purity. I find that very strange, and I don't think it's necessarily better elsewhere, because that argument exists elsewhere as well. But it segues to my next question for Catherine, is that you quote Manderson in his Dance Macabre Temporality of Law in the Visual Arts, and he argues representation has a double meaning. To represent is not only to portray, but more significantly to advocate. And I think that's the core of this argument, that, you know, sort of like what Juno's talking about is a very, very deliberate strategy of advocacy. And that, do you mind expanding on that a bit?
Well, look, during the week I had a difficult conversation with two people, and it was to do with speaking, and I'll just give you a bit of the context. I don't know who you all are and so on, but there were two Jewish women, and they had very different opinions about what's going on in the world now. And is more open to a bigger discussion about what's going on in Gaza Strip, for example. See, what we need, as a peace advocate that she is, what we need is to, we need to change this person. We need to change our relationships with each other. And then we need to advocate. We need to participate. We need to speak up and not just say, oh, I agree with it, of course I do, but I just wasn't there. We need to take action. Juno knows all about that. She said that's been her life. But I just think that that kind of recognising that ongoing advocacy is what works. That's why we look. I do look. I'm doing a lot of research at the moment about the reception of Aboriginal art more broadly in Europe, and I do think we have changed as a nation. I do think we have as a result of this. I think that when we see any kind of Aboriginal work, it's not just words. It's true that we see that there is both a it might strike some people as being an abstract, let's say, painting or something, but it is very much to do with the ongoing commitment to the land and the advocacy for the land. And we understand these dual things. That is to do with politics. It's also to do with aesthetics, and it's to do with 1,000 other things. And I think that those kinds of qualities come through in Juno's work too. This kind of sustained, it's not just getting a picture of, of whoever it is, Marcia Langton or something like that. It's not just saying, oh, see, there's Marcia. It's to inject a bit more into this ongoing advocacy for for the changes that are needed by us all in order to improve things. I don't know whether that makes any sense, Juno. But I think photography, and also because it does capture likenesses, especially when it's of people. But it's not. If it just stopped at that, it would be nothing worth having. So this added dimension of need for change is there.
Thank you, Catherine. Juno, your photographs display a real direct awareness of capturing or revealing moments of history in the making, and that of people, the activists who make history and demand change in history. But it reminds me, it reminds me of the statement by Lucy Libbard who said, if we are to make history, we need to document it. If we are to change history or how we view history, we need to document it. But she goes on, and this is the interesting bit, and make instructive its reading.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where your work absolutely functions. It's an awareness of the instructive capacity of photography.
Yes.
And you know, Malou said you're a master or perhaps a mistress of photography, but that instructive quality is I think alludes to that something extra, that making the visible, that encounters history not only in the making, but what we need to do about it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Like if you think of the two images of Marcia Langton in that book, there's one that is sort of become very iconic because it's been reproduced everywhere all over the place, which is of Marcia as this beautiful, strong, young activist in Queensland in the 1982 marches for land rights in front of the Commonwealth Gates. Now, we were actually there together at that event, and she was terrified. Everybody was so scared because the racist government of the Peterson government was after us, and once we got in a cab and we were going over to Farrer office, and she said, "Get down on the floor." And I said, "Why have we got to be on the floor of the cab, and she said, "Do you not know that we're being followed all the time?" And out of that fear and courage, there's this magnificent, you know, it's this astonishing image of her just flicking me a look, which was like given to me as she was marching down the street where we knew there were 500 cops down the end of it. And it was full of courage and resilience and determination. And so, you know, I always looked for those moments, and people knew I did. And that's what I mean in a collaborative sense. So 40 years later, and she's the head of Indigenous Unit at La Trobe University or Melbourne University, whatever it is. And she says, "Juno, we need another portrait. I can't see that one. But, you know, it's just reproduced everywhere, all the time. We've got to have a more current one." So the Deadlies were coming on. And the Deadlies were this marvellous celebration of Aboriginal achievement and excellence that were out at the Sydney Opera House for about 10 years, just devised by this fantastic guy who had this great idea that everybody supported, where Aboriginal excellence in absolutely every field could be celebrated. And she was going to moot the first Marcia Langton Award in academic, can't remember if it's anthropology or geography or what it was in. Anyway, so we were backstage at the Opera House and in the dressing room, and there's this really, you can see her power, her dignity, her fierce mind is all there. And that's what I would always try to do, because I knew these people. These people are not unknown to me, I know them really well. So I try and get as much in to that portrait so it would say as much about her at that particular time in her life. So it would stand the test of time, because one of the great things I love about portraits is you think about many of the great writers or artists that you know them from their portraits. Who are they as human beings? I'm not talking about their work, I'm talking about who are they as human beings. And often you get your richest sense of that from a really good portrait. So that's really what I tried to do.
I'm glad you're talking about those two images, Marcia Langton, because that segues to my next question, is that your practice, you know, over the last 50-odd years has in documenting the activism and the demand of Indigenous rights has also paralleled the development of contemporary feminism as we understand it. And Susan Sontag said, "It seems to me that women have a bigger chance of success in photography than men. Women are quicker and more adaptable than men, and I think have an intuition that helps them to understand personalities more quickly than men." Do you think that the fact that you're a woman, that what you're looking at through the lens, and particularly when it's women's subjects, this issue of the development of feminism and being a woman impacts on your photography?
Well, I've always been a feminist, so that's strongly there. But I mean, it's a very kind thing that only a woman writer would write, unfortunately. But I think it is there that women have this capacity to reach in and really search for who that person really is, and then find a way to reveal it. It's different from the kind of formalism that many male photographers have. I love the work of Irving Penn, I love the work of Richard Avedon. There's many great photographers, Brassai, that I've studied for years and years. But I also love the women photographers, Tina Mendotti, Lee Miller. These are all women photographers. The women photographers particularly I studied. They're how I learned, and I was really fortunate, because when I took a small body of pictures from Mornington Island, a community I worked with for 3 years, to England, I met this guy called David Turner, and he was the editor of Creative Camera, the best photographic magazine in England at that time. And he just really loved those pictures, and he got me a scholarship from the British Arts Council to go to the Oxford Photographic Workshop and work with David Ahern, and Aaron Siskin was there, Brian Altiero, and a really great pop photographer who just died recently. I'm trying to think of his name now. Brian Griffin, fantastic photographer. So, you know, this is the way I didn't learn in any kind of a conventional way. I didn't go to art school, I didn't go to TAFE. I just happened to luck into some great master classes with great photographers, and I would pick their brains, and I would love to learn from them. And I learned a lot from the women, and I think that quote of Sontag's pretty spot on.
And do you think sort of, because in your photographs in the book, you know, there's, if I was to just roughly break it down, you've got photographs of strong men, you've got photographs of strong, very strong women, and then you've got community type photographs, cultural sort of. What struck me when working with you day in, day out at that computer, looking at these photographs, trying to sort them and organise them into a dialogue or a narrative, what struck me was, and we discussed it at that time, that I thought the way you engaged community could only have been viewed from a women's perspective. I sense that those photographs were more relational to the fact that you were a woman, because you seem to understand the setting and the demands of that community from a women's perspective.
Well, that's really true, but it's also true that from a cultural point of view, in all communities, particularly when I was there with my younger son, and like with Mornington that I worked with for 3 years, so that I was culturally viewed as an unmarried woman with a child, and I had a skin name given to me, and I had a relationship with Jackson Jacobson and Enid, who was my first brother. And what that gave me, and this would be replicated in every community I went to differently, it gives you a way of being related to everybody else. And it gives you a clue as to what the rules of your behaviour needs to be. As a single unmarried woman, when there was a community meeting or a meeting to do with ceremony, I knew where my place was. I knew where to sit. And there were, on Mornington, for example, there were really complicated cultural mores. Like I might look at you, and my sister might say, "You cannot talk to him because he's your grandmother." And I had to remember stuff like that. It was really intricate. But these relationships gave me my place within community, wherever I went. And that gave me a way of working that was, you know, just absolutely key to what I did. Because I was always aware of what community imperatives were. I could ask questions. And some people have said, I think Larissa Baram said, that there's a really strong emphasis on portraits of women. And that's true, and it is intentional, because quite often the histories have been pretty imbalanced, and they haven't given women the sort of acknowledgement. So as I knew so many really brilliant women who were leaders in their community and who had brilliant minds and who were deeply effective in their communities and in the movement as a whole, in terms of working out strategies and where do we go from here, I tried to give them and restore to them their place.
I I think that for me, it certainly comes across when I look at how and why and the unspoken aspect of the women's subjects. You seem to sort of like capture some power that that's a very feminine, a feminist or women's power, whereas with the men, the attitude of the camera is somewhat different. That you're capturing history and acknowledging history, but it's a different intimacy when your camera examines the, your focus.
Well, I'm more restricted there. I mean, I always had lawmen that I had really relationships with that I could ask about, ceremonial questions and cultural questions within the community. But it was a more formal relationship, so those images tend to be more formal.
Yeah. And I noticed now that you take a lot of photos with your iPhone, and that although the other week when I took you to head on, you went into panic because you forgot your camera and you wanted to use a camera, so you borrowed one. Is there how do you view that mobile device as a camera weapon and the actual?
It's very seductive because it's so available to you. It's so great in low light, and it's become a diary mechanism. It's a visual record of your day, and you can do portraits on it. You can do anything on it, really. And it's, I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years' time there were very few cameras around and only really serious photographers who use them.
Right. In the book, are there any photographs that
are digital?
Yeah.
I think two. Yeah.
Okay, that's me. Is it other?
Last weekend, was it last weekend? We were at Atrium.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was without the use of my iPhone for 2 days. And the next night I was here, and I felt naked without being able to use my iPhone. I wasn't able to take any photographs. So I'm borrowing your photographs and Jenny Templin's. When I arrived in Australia in 1970, I was a total newbie. My Australian brother-in-law took me to Hobart Museum, and that was my introduction to anything. I wouldn't exactly say Aboriginal art. What I saw was actually Truganini and Truganana, the skulls, and that was all, and animal skins and things like that. That was my introduction of culture as far as I knew it then. But I think Australia have moved a long way. I think, yeah. I think
We can all agree on that.
Yeah. We can move forward. Now,
Onwards.
we are using Aboriginal names for the stations, and it's good.
A lot of
It's a good
recognition.
move. We're all moving forward.
Got a long way to go, but we've got a long way so far.
Okay, thank you very much, Juno, Nick, and Catherine for a very interesting conversation. So you can put your hand together, all three of you.